Our next speaker, I'm very, very happy to announce that Anant Sharma. He is the CEO of a great agency in London called Matter of Form. And we've been discussing last night about what talk is going to happen today. And I think he switched it, or he didn't, but he's going to talk about all the psychology of luxury, I guess, or is it that?
Yeah.
And please give it up for Anant Sharma. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, correct. We had a number of cocktails last night together, and full of self-doubt and a little bit of loathing for the talk that I had written, I decided to change everything this morning. And so I was going to talk about, tennis bracelets and gold volatility. I was going to add some pointers on where I thought the industry was going next. But I sort of realized that I'm probably talking to an audience who've heard a lot about that over the course of the day. And maybe there are a couple of other things that are important reminders in a world where our attention is being increasingly disrupted. So can I just start by asking, how many people here feel in their businesses they could do a better job of communicating what's special about what they do? Okay, well, at least I have an audience. That's a good start. So I'll just introduce myself quickly. I run a business called Matter of Form, and we do three things. We do brand development, so reinventing organizations or thinking about their future, customer experience or guest experience, so what are all of the touch points? What's the whole consumer journey? And then experience transformation. So, what are the content dependencies? What are the digital dependencies? What does the store look like? And we say we help timeless brands design what's next, partially because I hate the word luxury. I think that the defining characteristics of great luxury are design as a point of competitive advantage, long-termism, and a level of founding spirit. And I think a lot of luxury has just become a search term. So we do it for all sorts, from LVMH to Mandarin Oriental to Zaha Hadid. And I've avoided using any of our clients in the watches and jewelry space. But there are many in that space too. So I just want to start with an experiment that I came across recently that I thought was interesting. Men and women were locked in a room for 15 minutes, and they were told they could have their phones back in return for an electric shock. Now, the participants were not masochists. These were people who, on the whole, were afraid of receiving an electric shock. And I'm ashamed to say that 62% of men took the shock, in some cases twice, to have their phones back. Only 25% of women say that what it will about the fairer sex. This is what we're fighting for, right? We're fighting for attention. Right? We are living in a deeply noisy world where all of our narrative, right, is subject to a level of disruption. Now, for about 7,000 years, we've been innovating product. Right? We've been innovating product through necessity. Right? We've wanted to upgrade our level of life. We wanted to get places quicker. We've wanted to sort of enter an age of abundance. But the truth is today, we are pretty far up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Right? We're not like hunting for our steak. Every act of consumerism that we engage in is an act of self-expression. I think it's really important to remember this. You can't quantify the value of your experience. Right? You can't really quantify the value of a luxury product. Everything is based on framing. I think most people would agree that those two internal grey squares look like they're different colors. I've just lost a screen. Anyway. Obviously, when you remove the frame, they're revealed as being the same. That's my poor attempt at a mock-up in Keynote, but the point remains. Right? everything is subject to a relative point of reference. Shakespeare said it very well many years ago. Nothing in this world is good or bad. It's thinking that makes it so. I could be standing on this stage having a terrible time, and you could be sitting there having a wonderful time, but we're in the same incredibly large hall, aren't we? Like everything is how we architect thought. We're in the business of symbolic value and giving meaning, personal meaning, to people through things they buy that are precious and beautiful. Now, even in the rest of the product economy, right? This is Salesforce data. This is a company who always churn out a lot of data that I'm incredibly suspicious of, but I'm using it merely to make a point. People believe the experience is more important than the product itself. And that means the service. It means, the user experience, what happens before, what happens after. It even means like the unboxing, right? These little touch points that we can overlook or underinvest in. I mean, there are like million-dollar industries on YouTube of people opening Nike shoes. How all of these things come together in symphony, that is our product. Now, the problem is, if we don't get these things in congruence, right, if there's a gap in promise, right, if we say one thing and then what people get is slightly different, if there's a tonal gap, and if there's a bit of a handoff void, you erode trust, you dilute value, which is incredibly important in a business that's entirely predicated on perceived value, and you lose loyalty. In fact, there's a part of the prefrontal cortex called the VMPFC where you're constantly figuring out how to assign subjective value cognitively to the things around you. That part of our brain is constantly active today, right? Because most things are subjective. Right? We're not fighting for survival. Well, we're certainly not the fortunate people in this room who work in this industry. Basically, optimal congruity, I won't go too deep into this, but it's luxuries, it's a complex combination of you've got to feel familiar. A luxury is about comfort and convenience. But if it's only about comfort and convenience without the right blend of surprise, then it feels expected and boring and like a utility. When those things come together well, when the promise and the expectation, all these things feel that they're in coherence, that's actually what creates gut feeling. You can design for gut feeling. Now, when you're designing for gut feeling, you actually have to have an insight about who you're designing for. Because look around this hall, there's a lot of competition in the world today, right? So unless you have a clear sense of self, what your promise is, and how you imbue the spirit of that promise across every touch point in your journey, well, you just dilute yourself, you just become a commodity. Today we have a portfolio of identities, right? We're looking to express ourselves in all different sorts of ways. And in the context of travel, I will go backpacking with my friends, which I did 6 years ago with my guy friends. I literally stayed in hostels. I was probably having a little bit of a midlife crisis. But I will also take my family and stay in an Oman resort. We actualize ourselves in very, very different ways, and the brand has become a shortcut into how we express ourselves creatively. So this singular focus of promise has never been more important. Now, that involves looking at the world through the lens of the customer that you're actually trying to design for. I use it's like this mythological example in the world of innovation of IDEO, who are a design company, who were asked a decade ago to redesign the interior patient experience of a very high-end private hospital chain in America. And all of the board members, they expected IDEO to come back into the room with, some amazing art choices for the walls and a new interior design that was incredibly slick and felt like a high-end hospitality experience. And they came back and they played a 6-minute video of the ceiling. And their message was simple, which was the majority of people who come into your hospital are on their back looking at the ceiling, and it's cracked and yellowing, and it's a little bit disturbing when that's your first touch point. Now, this is a slightly exaggerated example, right? But I think it's very important to think about what is the first touch point? How do your clients or prospective clients see who you are? How do they organize their experience psychologically? And what shortcuts are you giving them to help them feel the way you want them to feel when they buy into your brand world? For that, you've got to have insight. You've got to spend a bit of time actually trying to understand who you're going after. But people get very confused between like a fact, an observation, and an insight. A fact is something you know to be true. Right? An observation is something you watch. Right? You might sort of observe me doing this talk. An insight is a new way of looking at something that unlocks growth. But in the context of luxury, I like to define it as the gap between what people say and how they act. There's always a gap. Now, consultants love to come in and talk about how big the market is. It was big market, it's worth, trillions. Every consultancy has a different number. Compound annual growth rates, like, 9.5%. Tennis bracelets, 12% growth. 360 billion, there's some of that, the fashion's going down, jewelry and watches are going up, yada, yada, yada. The problem with all of this is that actually we end up in this like big homogenous pool of how luxury is actually defined. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got these like billionaire buyouts, people like buying whole islands. Private islands don't have a very good name at the moment, so let's move on from that. But then you've also got a third of like purchases, and experiences coming from people who, and I don't mean to sound condescending, but people who aren't like actually millionaires, but they perhaps live in an economy where they subscribe to more things than they used to once have as capex expenditures. There's an entire generation who aren't counting on owning a home, and they're looking for ways of celebrating and finding symbolic meaning in the everyday. Now, the problem with this, and I do not know why I've chosen Darth Vader as a background slide for this, but whatever, is that with all growth comes noise, right? And with noise comes homogenization. So if you look at like the luxury industry, you end up with so many options that you're trying to close the next tab. Right? I'm not looking for ways of finding something exciting as much as I am looking for ways of getting rid of something that's lost my trust. And everything looks the fucking same. I presented this to a client in the hospitality industry a couple of years ago, and they couldn't pick out their own brand. And this is true across categories. I chose not to use. We have similar slides that we use across different sectors. It's amusing, no? Everyone thinks things are special about themselves that are just table stakes, become table stakes. The average consumer today has 250,000 micro moments and 45 interactions between awareness and conversion. Right? And so, the natural tendency is like let's shout louder. Especially if you're a big brand. Let's buy more media. Let's go for a bigger message. Let's be more innovative. In COVID, you had like Arnold Arnoux doing like NFTs, and you had like Citizen M buying, real estate in the metaverse. And what's it going to take to grab some attention? But the truth is that actually it's far more effective to lure someone into your world through action. Right? Benjamin Franklin said something that I actually love this. This little anecdote. He said, if you want someone to like you, get them to do you a favor. Right? If they like you, if they do you the favor, they'll post-rationalize. They must have liked you enough to have done you the favor to begin with. On the whole, people like to ensure that there's a congruence between their thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Right? What does that mean? That means that you can hammer people over the head with a message and try and get them to buy something. But if you can draw them into your world and get them to invest a little bit of effort in you, they're more likely to create a belief system that supports the thing that you've got them to do. And it's like, this is actually what cognitive behavioral therapy is based on. You know? There's an old way of doing things that was very linear, but we're in a multi-channel, multifaceted world. And if you can get people to agree to the next yes, they'll become part of your brand ecosystem. And in order to do that, I won't go too deeply into this, but it's a combination of motivation, ease, and it creates behavioral propensity. And so motivation is built of... I've actually deleted the slides, so don't worry about it. It was too technical and boring. I just want to give you a couple of interesting behavioral psychology examples that hopefully you'll be able to transpose in the context of your own businesses or lives. And I think this is important in the jewelry sector. In white picket fence America, people were asked to put a sign up in their front yards saying, "Please drive more slowly." I mean, no one wants a sign in their front yard saying, "Please drive more slowly." 6% of people put the sign up. Another cohort were asked to put a sticker in the back of their car saying, "Please drive more slowly." Of course, most people put the sticker in the back of their car, and these people were then asked 2 weeks later to put the sign in their front yard. 75% of people put the sign up. Now, the reason for that is in their minds, they'd become one of those people who ask others to drive more slowly. Right? You've sort of invited them into the tribe. So, and this like concept of tribalism and the tribe... and the tribe you're designing for, I think represents... I'll just wait a moment. It's in English next. Excuse me, Mr. Is there any way you could switch that screen so I can see what the next slide is? Because I've basically wrote this morning. You can't do it. Okay. Don't worry. What? No, I just don't know what's next. Okay, so thanks, man. I need the support. Okay, this is another interesting example that I've always... So there was a major hotel group, and they wanted people to reuse their towels. So they wrote a message in every room, a big hotel group, like tens of thousands of inventory. They put a sign in all the rooms, and it said, "For environmental reasons, please reuse your towel." Like 10% of people reuse their towels. These numbers are inexact. I'm not a believer in statistics. Statistics are to be used like a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not illumination. Anyway, they then ran another message in all of the rooms that said most people reuse their towels. Okay, so this uses the very basic principle of social proof. 15% extra people reuse their towels. It is like hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. It then ran a third message which introduced the concept of immediacy to the concept of social proof. So it then said, most people in this room reuse their towels. There's another 12% increase. So you're looking at this enormous variance on this tiny branded moment within a hotel room. If you want to get people to do something, you need to think about how you phrase things to create a behavioral propensity for that thing to happen. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. If you want to invite them into your tribe, what are the series of yeses or sequence of interactions that are going to draw them in? You know, in many ways, we're like going bigger and bigger in life, right? We're like traveling further afield to find things that are unique. I mean, we're like going to space. It's going to be a $10 billion industry by 2030. But really what we're trying to do is find something that sits deeper within. Right? Luxury is like an excuse to spend time with yourself. You know, it's like we're buying our own time in a world where we've optimized everything. So I think there's a very, very important aspect of how you think about communication and how you think about branding and how you think about your products, which is how do you actually make people feel about the choices they make? Like the experience that I'm having right now is directly proportionate to the opportunity cost of the experience I think I could be having otherwise. Right? The great burden of the high net worth individual is cognitive dissonance. It's having too much choice. In the words of Su Lao, right, to say I don't have time, which is what a lot of people say these days, is to say, I don't want to. Yet, we're optimizing everything to death. You know, we're obsessed with optimization, to go back to the wheel. Right? You know, we've like, this is life today. It's like, you know, you don't know the name of your grocer anymore. Right? And the problem with that is when things are too easy, and there's no arc, there's no sort of journey that you move through, there's no tension, then there is no story. Right? And we are hardwired for the hero's journey. You know, we are all looking to, through the products and the experiences we engage in, go through a level of personal transformation, even if we end up back in the same physical place that we started. The other thing I want to talk about is messaging, because I think the luxury industry gets messaging incredibly wrong. I start with this quote: "The artist rules his subjects by turning them into accomplices." Luxury is difficult, right? You're constantly like telling people how they should feel with these elaborate adjectives, you know, things like the art of living, you know. But something like this, where there's like a little bit of intellectual processing, will always be more effective. It'll get people thinking. And I think we need to introduce a bit more wit, right, in how we message things, rather than just copying the semiotics that are all the same across the whole industry. Not to, whatever. Like this ad, you know, I never read The Economist, said management trainee aged 42, right, is effective because it's like an intellectual compliment when you've worked it out, even though it's very, very basic. We need to get rid of like phrases like this. You know, we're telling people how they should feel. You know, hidden gems, lose yourself, trips of a lifetime, things that are world-class, or flavor explosions, or, you know, things that you'll remember for years to come, or slices of paradise. So, I mean, it's bullshit. You know, so I think we've got to strip that stuff out. We've got to have more precision with the language we use to set a stage for people to then feel something on their own. The other thing that I think is incredibly important as we enter this age of roll-ups and big global enterprise organizations and AI is going back to the emotion in your brand positioning and using that as a lens on the future. Right? Coco Chanel was an orphan who manifests success through dress. I was doing some work on Bugatti some years ago, and I was going through the archives, and someone tried to return a Bugatti car because the brakes failed, and he just said, you know, he just told the person to fuck off. He said, I make cars to go, not to stop. Astor, you know, from the St. Regis, he was like a kind of Trump type person of his era. He was so obsessed with opulence, he gold-plated the plumbing. You know. Listen, what's the founding story of your brand, and how do you use that personality as a lens on the future so that you can avoid some of that generic language and start having a position on the world? Because personality, imperfection, the soul of a thing, that's what matters in a world that's awash with AI and where most of luxury has been whitewashed with similar semiotics and sanitized language. A couple of other things that I want to talk about. Right? Expectations impact experience. We're designing something that is subjective through our products and how people feel about them and the process of buying what they buy and the journey they go through and the knowledge that they accrue as a result of the purchase they've made are as much a part of the product as the product itself. This experiment is a basic one, but chocolate cake, when it's served as chocolate cake, tastes 15% less good than chocolate cake that's called satin chocolate cake. That is like how basic we are as people. Scarcity, right? When there are 2 cookies in a jar, people rate the value of those cookies as 50% higher than when the cookie jar is full. There's a famous set of experiments in 1975 by a guy called Virchow. You know, scarcity is a funny thing, isn't it? It's like, it was like Edward VII, who was given the sort of like 3,000 carat diamond, and he said, if I'd seen it, I'd have just kicked it down the road. In fact, do you want to know something funny? Like a pineapple, in the 1600s, a pineapple, can anyone guess how much a pineapple cost? Well, it wasn't quite, but I'll tell you something that did cost a house actually in a moment. But a pineapple cost £5,000, £5,000, and 5,000 euros. And the reason it cost so much is because people used it as an excuse to tell stories about cultures afar. People would put their pineapples on display till they'd rot, and they were so proud of them. There's an earl in the north of England called the Earl of Dunmore. He built an entire shrine to pineapples. It's quite funny. But yes, actually, a handful of nutmeg could buy you a ship in the 1600s, and some cloves could buy you an estate. So, scarcity is a funny thing, right? And then with the pineapples, I won't go too much to the pineapples. Actually, let's move on. So, the other thing that I want to talk about is, how do you bring the process that goes into your product to the forefront of your story? Now, when you see these and I want to borrow a concept from user experience here. When you see these progress bars, when you're booking a flight, on booking.com or Skyscanner or whatever, it's fake, right? It is pretending it's taking a couple of seconds because it increases your trust in the price being the best price, and you're more likely to buy something. You're more likely to trust that actually this platform has provided you the cheapest flight option. Now, we're not in the business of selling, we're not selling flights, are we? Right? But, this is true in all service businesses. Locksmiths have to pretend that it takes far longer to unlock your door. It takes them there's a tool, it takes 2 minutes. But people have this come down effect. They have a remorse of what they've spent when it's too fast. They don't want to pay for the expertise or the technology that enables this to happen quickly. They want to pay for a level of effort. I think that's very important in a world that's becoming mechanized and automated. It's very the screen's whatever, it doesn't matter. The great burden of wealth today is choice, right? It really is. We just have too much choice. It's a cognitive dissonance is a problem. And so when you're presenting things to your clients, you need to think about how you almost provide a level of consultancy or therapy that then allows you to make choices on their behalf. It's another famous experiment in choice that was 3 jams were sold on the side of a road, and just up the road there was 25 jams. I've got 2 minutes left. That's impossible. I'll never finish. Okay, hang on. Okay, listen. I'm just going to touch on 1 or 2 key things, right? Because I have run out of time, it seems. Has anyone seen this experiment? It's like a pop psychology experiment, and people are asked to count the number of passes in an NBA game, and they count 12 passes, 13 passes. Some people are obviously idiots. They're 20 passes, and then they play the video again, and they ask people if they've seen the 12-foot ape walking through the middle of the game. And no one has seen the ape. And I just think your brand is a little bit like that, right? It's navigation. People will see what you tell them to see. Right? You need to sequence a set of interactions in a way that gives them guidance to see value where you want to show them value. The brain cheats itself, right? Sommeliers in training were given white wine that was dyed red, when they all just judged it like red wine. That really is how simple we are. So what does this mean? What it means is that your brand matters to your client's brain more than your product. So we need to ask ourselves some fairly basic questions. Are we writing the right storyboard for our clients? Right? Are we evoking the correct emotion? Do we know what that emotion is supposed to be? Can we be specific about it? Are we encouraging the desired behaviors? And are we asking the right questions? Because in the words of the very alluring, let's be honest, Margot Robbie, right? Sometimes it's the feeling of a thing, it's the feeling of anticipation that's more important than the thing itself. And when not said by Margot Robbie, it's also backed up by actual science, right? Like, brain imaging shows that your dopamine peaks before, right? Not during the reward. And so this is probably a fairly good place to end, even though it's actually nowhere near the end. 26 letters. Is that how many letters are in English? 28? There are 26. Great. I don't look like an idiot. Rearranging 26 letters can change everything about your world. Right? Words contain worlds. Don't forget that when you're thinking about how you communicate. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, maybe we have time for one question. And then I'm sure Anant will be still around for a few minutes if you want to ask him. Yeah, one question there.
Oh, my microphones are scary, but it's more of a reflection than a question. While listening to you, I got an impression that the luxury isn't about selling a thing, a product. It's more about selling a tool to fulfill yourself, a ritual, if I may.
Yeah, it's every act of consumerism is an act of self-expression. I think that this is how I would think about it. You can innovate the product, but you need to innovate the psychology as well, right? What a great world we'd live in if we could reframe what we already have to make it feel more valuable, rather than mining this earth for more. And so I think it's important to think about it, right? Like, how do you shape thought?
Through ritual.
Exactly. Well, I've got a whole other presentation on ritual, but...
Thank you.